Hello, and welcome to Behind the Insights, where we pull back the curtain to share real world data, AI, and evidence generation insights from the industry's top thought leaders. I'm your host, Michelle Levy, and today we're exploring the FDA's new draft guidance on post approval data collection for cell and gene therapy products. To help unpack what it all means, I'm joined today by Dr. Rich Glicklich, an expert in real world data and registries. So let's start with the big picture. What is this new FDA draft guidance about, and why is it important?
Well, thanks, Michelle. Well, the document is titled Post-Approval Methods to Capture Safety and Efficacy Data for Cell and Gene Therapy Products. It's important because there's a lot more experimentation done preclinically and now clinical trials that are employing these techniques. And now, as these products reach the market, the question becomes, how do you collect long-term safety and effectiveness data? Because some of these products can have effects that are unknown. They may go, it may be 10, 15 years before we know. And so the document highlights a couple of things. First, that need for long-term follow-up in these types of studies. Second, the limitations of typical real-world data sources like claims and electronic health records. And it's interesting because the third thing the document does, it points out the central and superior role of registries for capturing high-quality data for cell and gene therapies. And it also gives a nod to decentralized approaches. And we'll talk a little bit about that probably with some of your upcoming questions as well.
So this is really about helping us better understand these therapies once they're already out and on the market.
Yeah, exactly. These therapies, just by their name alone, right? When you change the genes, you're going to expect lifelong effects. So, pre-market trials don't capture everything that's post-approval, and yet we can't wait on these therapies because they're so promising to hold back approval. That's where post-approval safety studies and effectiveness studies come into gear. And this document really outlines how that type of data can be collected to meet post-marketing commitments that invariably will follow most of these types of programs.
So you mentioned that in thinking about these types of programs, that not all of these real world data sources are ideal. So what are some of the limitations of the different sources?
Yeah, again, another great question, Michelle. Claims and electronic health records data can be incredibly helpful for understanding utilization, understanding practice and care, performing background studies. But when you get to rare diseases or diseases where you have small populations and other types of conditions as well, there can be major gaps. In any condition where there's very specific key clinical variables, depending on who you collect the data from and whether or not they're focused on collecting those clinical variables, they may or may not exist. And one another problem with rare diseases in general and rare treatments like cell and gene therapy is relying on outdated coding systems, which again change to some extent over time, and fragmentation of data across providers and insurers because patients move between providers, they take new jobs, they end up with different insurers. It makes it hard to study long-term outcomes with confidence. So that's where the registries really come in.
So we've done a lot of work on registries over the years. Can you talk a little bit about how they fill some of those gaps?
Well, Michelle, if you recall, and I'm sure you do, when we defined registries years ago, we described them as observational study systems, if you will. So that word, registries, really can apply to observational long-term follow-up studies, rollover studies, a number of different types of programs, but let's use registries because that's what the FDA has used in this draft guidance. So you can think of registries as structured, curated data approaches that are protocol driven for specific patient populations. And they will capture standardized clinical, genomic, and potentially patient-reported outcomes over time. And because they have such flexibility and because they're protocol-driven, they can track everything from growth milestones in children to adherence to therapy to if there's progression or remission of an underlying disease, and whether or not the treatment shows persistence in use or whether there's issues with durability. So they fill in many of the gaps that EHR and claims data simply can't. I'm not saying you don't need potentially the EHR and claims data to be linked to those registries, because they really add a lot as a secondary source of data or as a passively collected source of data. But the registry protocolized approach gives you, that credence when you want to provide that data in a validated way back to regulators.
So it sounds like they're really an ideal option here for linking together these different data sources and then enabling long-term follow-up.
Yeah, precisely. That's what the document says. So they allow integration of genetic data, potentially biospecimens, patient-generated information in the future, the Fitbits of the world, all critical for cell and gene therapy research.
So then pivoting a bit, the FDA also mentions decentralized data collection. So what would that look like in practice?
Yeah, if you think back, decentralized clinical trials, came on the scene in the past decade. They've plateaued to some extent, but they really offer some great options. One is they reduce burden on patients who might be coming from a great distance to some wonderful center that does a cell or gene therapy, but then they return back to where they came from. And to reduce the burden on patients to be able to potentially do clinical outcomes assessments or patient-reported outcomes at a distance through telehealth makes participation easier and improves retention. One of the other things that we do is allow the patient to provide us consent to be able to also to pull their medical record on a regular basis to fill in some of the gaps that may be in those assessments, and also again to reduce burden on patients from that perspective. And the third thing it does, from a sponsor's perspective, is reduce costs. And actually, costs can get pretty low in in these programs because the numbers of patients generally are very low. And so we see these types of registries supported by AI and automation as the future of long-term follow-up and evidence generation, especially in cell and gene therapy, but in rare diseases and actually in common diseases, but without the decentralized component being necessary.
So it seems like this will be a major step forward in terms of accessibility and generalizability of the patient population.
Exactly. The decentralized approach reduces travel and site visits. These models help ensure data can come from diverse patient populations, patients at a distance from health systems, and so on. And then there's, always the regulatory side of the equation.
And on that regulatory side, what are some things that sponsors need to keep in mind?
So compliance is critical, right? The FDA in this draft guidance reminds sponsors that you need to adhere to all of the different draft and final guidance documents that have come around real world data and use of registries and so forth. It's critical that data ultimately is traceable, that it can be audited, that software packages managing post-approval data comply with 21 CFR Part 11. The protocol, as we talked about, needs to be well designed, IRB approval, informed consent, and of course, early consultation with the agency when selecting real world data sources and even designing the approach. Registries are not going away. If anything, they're rising in use, and the FDA is recognizing that the next evolution of registries for these smaller population programs are decentralized or will be decentralized.
So if you had to summarize this new guidance in one sentence, what would that be?
I'm too verbose to do it in one sentence, but I'll try. So it's a roadmap for responsibly using registries with decentralized data collection models to learn as much as possible from every patient undergoing a cell or gene therapy long after it's approved, and doing it in a way that's going to be compliant, less burdensome, and cost effective.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Rich, so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Michelle.
It's been a pleasure. And to our listeners, you can find more information about the draft guidance on our website at OM1.com, or you can follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and X. If you'd like to be notified about our next episode, make sure you're subscribed to our email list with the link located in the description. So until next time, thanks for tuning in to Behind the Insights.